Hello? In this video, we will talk about whether planets and stars influence the formation of personality and earthly events, as well as why the passion for astrology is a serious danger to humans. According to astrologers, astrological art, as they call it, is located at the junction of two worlds, physical and spiritual. Therefore, we will consider astrology from two points of view. From the point of view of science, and from the point of view of religion, since one scientific view is not enough in this case. But first, let's briefly touch on the history of astrology. Astrology is one of the oldest superstitions. It is mentioned several thousand years before our era. Although Babylon and Mesopotamia are considered to be the birthplace of astrology, it was born in parallel on several continents in India, China, and the Americas were not discovered yet. Babylonian priests considered the sun and planets to be deities shaping earthly events. The sun was a shaft, Venus and star or aster, and so on. These deities had statues in front of which incense was burned and sacrifices, including human sacrifices, were made. For example, in front of the idol of Val, parents burned their children. Subsequently, when the planets in astrology ceased to be considered gods, the influence of deities transformed into the influence of planets of unknown science. And here it is necessary to touch upon such a thing as the mechanism of astrology. For many millennia, up to the 20th century, the mechanism of astrology was understood as the so-called causality. That is, when the planets and stars directly affect the human Earth. But in the 20th century, it became clear that it was impossible to substantiate causality in a scientific way. Therefore, at the suggestion of Carl Gustav Jung, astrologers replaced causality with the so-called synchronism, in which the planets no longer influence the Earth, but rotate supposedly synchronously with earthly events. And it should be noted right away that synchronism does not solve the problem of influence, but simply pushes it into the background, attributing influence not to the planets, but to someone or something else. Jung studied astrology and alchemy. And in general, his whole life from his youth was filled, as it is now customary to say, with paranormal phenomena, for the justification of which he put forward the idea of synchronism, in fact paraphrasing the occult principle that above, then below. Synchronism was proposed by Jung to describe circumstances that seem related, but have no causal relationship. Ancient astrologers thought that the future could be predicted by the movement of the planets. For example, crops, droughts, floods, and any disasters. Believing that the luminary affects the Earth, astrologers substituted at what position this or that event happened, believing that if the situation repeats, the event must also repeat. That is, if event A happened in heaven, event B will happen on Earth. This astrology is called the astrology of omens. She was not familiar with individual horoscopes. She dealt with events of the scale of the state, including the life of the Tsar. Astrologers believed that planets literally form the Earth's climate. Now it seems absurd, but the scientist of the 2nd century Claudius Ptolemy wrote the following: Saturn causes a terrible cold, frosty, foggy, and pernicious. It has a bad effect on the air, causes clouds and darkness, and moreover, multiplies snowstorms, which are unwholesome, but destructive, from which reptiles harmful to humans are produced. As for rivers and seas, Saturn usually brings storms, shipwrecks, full of the dangers of travel. It is also the reason for the small number of fish deaths, strong tides, and river flooding, accompanied by water pollution. Saturn also leads to invasions of worms, locusts, or flooding, rain, hail, and the like, thus leading to famine and death of people. And also from there, Mars weakens the lungs and carries scabies and dandruff. Mercury makes men toothless, deaf and dumb, although, nevertheless, smart and cunning. Ptolemy was not only an astronomer, but also an astrologer. He collected the astrological superstitions formed at that time and wrote them down in the book Tetrabibus or Four Gun. And even then, that is, in the 2nd century. He mentions the existence of various schools in astrology, Babylonian and Chaldean. Also back then, he explains unfulfilled forecasts by the unprofessionalism of astrologers and a large number of charlatans. About inexperienced astrologers, he wrote that their number, as can be assumed, among those engaged in this important and multifaceted art is great. What does this mean? The fact that the number of unfulfilled predictions was also great, but it did not even occur to astrologers that astrology does not work. They blamed all the blunders on various external reasons, the unprofessionalism of charlatans and so on. And since the reason for unfulfilled forecasts, among other things, was seen in the imperfection of astronomy, in the inaccuracy of observations or incorrect calculations, they sought to increase this accuracy. Therefore, it can be said that astrological delusions in some way contributed to the development of astronomy. Speaking about the influence of planets on the character of people, Ptolemy wrote, "Mars, ruling over the soul, forces people, and it is written it forces to be cruel, defiant, bloodthirsty, destroyers, moths, screamers, grieved in physical violence, passionate, drinking, villains, ruthless, unbalanced, insane, hating their loved ones, unholy." As we can see, with this view of the world, a person practically ceases to be responsible for his actions, since he is completely controlled by the planets, for which astrology was criticized by Greek philosophers and later by Christian saints, because fate denies freedom and morality. If a person has been made a villain of the planet, then it is unfair to punish him for it. He needs help. Although how can you help him here? Now this approach seems too cardinal, and astrologers say that there is no determinism in astrology anymore, that is, there is no fate. But in fact, the endowment of a person with negative qualities, in spite of his will, is still present in astrology. For example, here is what Pavel Globa writes: people with Saturn in Leo are separated by incredible pride. Mars is called a small misfortune, and Saturn is called a big misfortune. Their combined effect leads to very bad consequences. And, by the way, astrologer Grego Risanta argues that it is not quite fair to call a person free, because by no effort, he can move the sun in his horoscope from one zodiac sign to another. And the horoscope is tied to him for life. And what some astrologers suggest to do with the negative moral qualities that the horoscope gives a person, we will find out closer to the end of this video. Until the 18th century, astrology was considered a science and was taught in European universities. But when it became clear that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and the constellations are not areas attached to the celestial dome that send some rays, faith in astrology began to weaken, and the paths of astronomy and astrology finally diverged. Astrology has fallen into the category of pseudoscience. And now let's take a brief look at what a horoscope is. European astrology has many types, but almost all of them are engaged in two main things: the construction of horoscopes or natal charts, and their explanation or interpretation. A horoscope is a schematic representation of the heavenly bodies visible from a certain place at a certain time. In other words, to build it, you need to enter the coordinates of the area, date and time into the astrological program. A horoscope can be built not only for a person's date of birth, then it is called a natal chart, but also for anything in general. For an entire country, for a business firm, for a ship, including a space one, and even for the very time when questions arise in your head. This is done by hourly astrology. The main elements of the horoscope are planets, houses, aspects, and the zodiac. Both positive and negative meanings are attributed to all this in astrology, and are combined in various ways in the horoscope. All of these symbolize one or another effect on man and the earth. European astrology uses mainly 10 planets. Why so many? Because the Sun and the Moon in astrology are considered planets orbiting the Earth. Since astrology still uses the Ptolemaic geocentric system, where the Earth is in the center. Planets in astrology are beneficial, neutral, and evil-creating. And if, because of the difference in the velocities of the planet's orbits, any planet appears to be moving in the opposite direction, that is, it makes a loop, then it is called retrograde. Retrograde in astrology is bad. It can spoil even the so-called beneficial planet. And often in the media, including on federal channels, you can see how astrologers talk about what can and cannot be done during periods of retrograde of a particular planet. For example, you cannot make purchases or make transactions. Only astrologers do not explain what to do to a person who, for example, has a turn for surgery. He refuses it or those, fearing that it will be unsuccessful. And it seems to me that if, having served astrologers, a person harms his health, or even more so his life, then their guilt before God will also be shared by the leaders of those media outlets that have provided them with a platform for statements. The next element of the gyroscope is the so-called astrological houses. These are hypothetical areas responsible for the daily movement of the Earth around its axis. There are 12 houses in astrology, and during the day each luminary is in all the houses, moving from one to another. Houses in astrology are also endowed with their own specific characteristics. For example, one house is responsible for the inner circle, another for finances, and the third for talents and abilities. To build houses in the horoscope, you need to know the exact time of birth. Without this, that is, without houses, the horoscope is called a cosmogram. In general, as we will note, astrologers are very fond of beautiful scientific names. The next element of the horoscope is the aspects or angular distances between the planets. From the planets in the horoscope, you can make triangles, squares, straight lines or oppositions, and so on. Aspects can also be both favorable and unfavorable. And the last element of the gyroscope that everyone has heard is the zodiac, which translates to a circle of small animals. Zodiac signs borrow names from constellations on the ecliptic. And the ecliptic is a one-year projection of the sun's motion visible from the Earth on the so-called celestial sphere. During the year, the sun passes through all the zodiacal constellations, being about a month in each of them. Even in ancient times, the ecliptic was divided into 12 equal parts of 30 degrees, roughly corresponding to the constellations. This was transferred to the horoscope and was called the zodiac signs. In which constellation was the sun on the day of your birth, such a zodiac sign was assigned to you by astrology. It is with the signs of the zodiac that such a thing as newspaper astrology is connected. Its foundations are attributed to the theosophist and astrologer Alan Leo, who is called the father of modern astrology. Unable to cope with the flow of customers who wanted to get to his appointment, he decided to give out recommendations on the signs of the zodiac. That is, newspaper astrology. It divides all of humanity into 12 large groups with the same characteristics. Science, of course, does not confirm this, but not everyone knows that even astrologers do not confirm this. Many of them distance themselves from newspaper astrology, saying that it has nothing to do with real astrology, since each person, according to them, is unique. Therefore, newspaper or magazine, or, as it is also called, yellow astrology, it has nothing to do with astrology, but simply has to do with the sales of newspaper magazines, since many people like these newspaper horoscopes. But there is another weighty argument against newspaper astrology. It is called the precession of the Earth's axis, or the shift of the constellations. The fact is that the Earth's axis itself rotates slowly, making a complete revolution in 26,000 years, or 1 degree 72 years. As a result, for more than 2,000 years since the adoption of the zodiac signs, the real constellations and zodiac signs in the horoscope have diverged by about 1 position. But European astrology did not take this into account and left the zodiac signs in place. What does this mean for you personally? This means that you and your loved ones do not have the zodiac sign that astrology tells you. It means that the sun on the day of your birth is in a completely different constellation. And, accordingly, if you follow the idea of ancient astrologers, you should have a different zodiac sign. Now you see on the screen a table with astrological and real data of the location of the sun in the constellations. For example, astrology assigns the Gemini sign to people born from the 21st of May to the 20th of June. But in reality, the sun is in Gemini from the 20th of June to the 20th of June. That is, the constellations have shifted about a month ahead. If you don't believe me, then everyone can check it right now. To do this, you need to download the free Stellarium program, which is a virtual planetarium, or go to her website. She has an online version. There, for convenience, you need to enter 12 o'clock in the afternoon so that you can see in which constellation the sun is located. Turn off the atmosphere, turn on the boundaries of the constellations, their names, and also enter the date and place of your birth. And then everyone will see that on the day of his birth, the sun was in a completely different constellation than astrology tells him. Therefore, if someone, after listening to the advice of astrologers, wore amulets with his zodiac sign all his life, or bought clothes to match the color of his zodiac sign, and even more so if someone made a tattoo with his sign, so that it supposedly brought him happiness, then he did it all in vain, wasted his time. But that, as they say, is not all. As we remember, the zodiac signs divide the ecliptic into 12 equal parts of 30 degrees, corresponding to 30 days. But in reality, the periods of the sun's passage through the constellations differ from 30 days. For example, the constellation of Virgo, the sun passes in 45 days, and the constellation of Scorpio in just 7 days. In addition, not everyone knows, but there are not 12 and 13 zodiac constellations. If you were born from the 30th of November to the 17th of December, then the sun during this period is in the constellation Ophiuchus. And there is simply no such zodiac sign in astrology. But someone will object. People agreed with the descriptions of their zodiac signs. Moreover, many agreed with the descriptions of the zodiac signs of their loved ones, that is, they saw the correspondence of their characters with the descriptions given by astrology. So that's the whole point. People are willing to agree with descriptions of other people's zodiac signs when they think that these signs belong to them. And all this works thanks to the Barnum effect, for which 3 conditions must be met. The first is that the description should be made specifically for the person, so that he thinks that it is made for him. In this case, for his zodiac sign. The second is that the description should be made by an authoritative source. In this case, it is an ancient science, well, by which they mean astrology. And the third thing is to have mostly positive characteristics in the description. And as an illustration of what has been said, we can cite the experiment of the French astrology researcher Michel Gauquelin. He placed an ad in the newspaper, promising to send a detailed horoscope to anyone who would send him his date and place of birth. He sent a 10-page horoscope to all those who responded, and 94% of respondents confirmed that the horoscope accurately described them, and 90% said that their relatives also confirmed it. That is, they said, yes, you are described in the horoscope. But as it turned out, Gauquelin sent everyone the same horoscope, belonging to the serial killer doctor, Marcel Tite. But someone will say, you just need to take into account the precession of the Earth's axis and bring the zodiac signs in the horoscope, in accordance with the position of the constellations. But the fact is that if it had somehow affected the accuracy of forecasts, astrologers, of course, would have done it long ago. In addition, not everyone knows, but the zodiac signs in the horoscope are no longer connected with the constellations in any way. Here's what the famous astrologer of the 20th century, Dane Radyar, writes about the zodiac. Let's not forget that this is no more than the Earth's orbit, divided into 12 sectors of 30 degrees. It has nothing to do with constellations. Do you understand what's going on? Astrology, in the minds of many, is connected with the cosmos and the stars as a science that has comprehended the mystery of the stars. But of the stars in astrology, there were only zodiac constellations. And since the zodiac is no longer connected by constellations, it's like there are no stars for astrology. There is no place for stars in the science of stars astrology. Therefore, astrology is limited to the cosmos only within the solar system and does not go beyond it. They may object, saying that the horoscope can take into account some fixed stars, but this is clarifying, optional, and secondary in nature and is almost not used today. Thus, the zodiac in the horoscope turns into the same fictitious hypothetical construction as houses and aspects. With the same success, the name of the constellations could be replaced with Nif Nif, Naf Naf and Noof Noof, or Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. And if you were born Winnie the Pooh, then you are simple, sincere, and loving to eat. And if in a piglet, a modest, cautious, but loyal friend. But it wouldn't sound so mysterious. And I must say, is almost everything for astrology. It's all based on it. That is, in the field of ancient mystical science, which, of course, it is not, which we will discuss in detail later. So, what have we learned? Astrology is the belief that the planets, falling into certain areas of the picture, called the horoscope, determine literally everything on Earth. The character of a person, his talents, health or illness, relationships, business, such as shopping, travel, treatment, and so on, as well as the fate of entire nations and world cataclysms. Although no cataclysm has yet been predicted by astrologers in advance, but only after the fact, like I foresaw it. If you foresaw this, then you should have informed a little in advance. For example, I would have called the Gemini Tower and said that they would collapse, and if they didn't believe you, then I would have called the police and said that the tower was mined. Then, according to the law, everyone would have to be evacuated. Then they would begin to understand and astrology would return to universities again. It would seem that this is your sphere, but we don't see anything like that from astrologers. Why? The answer to this question is not as obvious as many might think. Well, that is because astrology just doesn't work. To answer it, you need to get to the very essence of astrology. But first, let's close for ourselves the question that worries many. Is astrology a science? As the historian Bushel Clark said, astrology is a faith that speaks the language of science. And this science, which is unable to confirm its principles with anything but faith. Strictly speaking, most astrologers do not consider it a science. Rather, this is what the popularizers of astrology call it, realizing that in the image of science, especially with a touch of some mysticism and ancient wisdom, it will find more confidence in itself. But since the question of the scientific nature of astrology is periodically raised, let's consider it. Some proponents of astrology put forward the opinion that planets and stars influence their fields. They are combined in various ways. These fields have both positive and negative effects on personality formation and earthly events. There is nothing complicated here. All of this can be calculated and even predicted. Of the interactions known to science, in this case, it is appropriate to talk only about gravitational and electromagnetic. At the same time, the gravitational effect from the stars will be several billion times weaker than from Mars, and from it, several thousand times weaker than from the Moon. A passing trolleybus has a stronger gravitational effect on us than Mars. And the flows of particles and electromagnetic radiation from stars are so small that their registration even with the most sensitive devices, called radio telescopes, requires considerable effort. The electromagnetic and gravitational fields of the planet of stars, overlapping each other, form an insignificant noise that accompanies a person from birth to death, which is approximately constant, and to which a person is adapted. If it has any effect on a person, it is not this noise, but the so-called electromagnetic smog generated by a lot of electrical appliances, electrical wiring, and so on. Also, flashes occur periodically on the sun, and streams of particles reaching the Earth can cause not only the northern lights, but also worsen the well-being of some people who are sensitive to it. But astrology doesn't do that. This is done by completely different sciences. She can't predict solar flares. Sometimes astrologers point to the moon and the tide as evidence of the influence of the planets, saying, "Do you see the moon?" "Yes, we see." "There you go." That is, if we continue their logic, a person consists mostly of water, and gravity can theoretically influence the brain to participate in the formation of character. To some, it may even sound convincing. But even if we forget that with this approach, only the sun and the moon remain in astrology, and everything disappears altogether, how could astrologers calculate the effect of gravity on brain regions? According to what formulas, they learned that the moon of a man, in the quadrature of their Mars of a woman, means a complete lack of any harmony and an absolute emotional misunderstanding between partners. And we must remember that the ancient astrologers were not familiar with the functions of the brain departments at all. But in general, it is not necessary to talk about the influence of gravity on the brain, and thus on the formation of character, because a person is constantly in motion. If we assume that the moon is, for example, on the right side of me and causes a rush of blood to the right hemisphere, and I turned around and the blood flow shifted, how is astrology going to take this into account? The man was asleep and turned over on his other side. Therefore, even the arguments themselves on this topic, they are not of a scientific nature, rather just blurting out the question. Astrologers of the so-called scientific wing do not, and cannot offer any mechanism for determining the influence of fields and particles known to science on a person. Realizing that the mechanism of astrology cannot be justified and formed with the help of gravitational electromagnetic interactions, some astrologers turned their attention to quantum mechanics with its quantum entanglement and generally some illogicality. Quantum mechanics assumes that there is a connection between apparently unrelated objects, for example, two photons. And then astrologers saw a certain consonance with Jung's synchronization. Since it is also impossible to establish a connection between the planets and earthly events, but astrologers believe that it exists. But as we understand it, astrologers' conversations about quantum mechanics, cybernetics, and other sciences do not contain anything concrete. I would even call it, I don't want to offend anyone, scientific chatter. For example, here is a quote from an astrological website. If earlier astrologers thought that the influence of the electromagnetic fields of the planets acts on a person, now we know that everything is much deeper. The influence is at the subatomic level, or to be more precise, at the energy level. Such reasoning can justify any pseudoscientific concept. For example, I walk along the road, count the poles, then divide them by my age, and multiply by body weight. And I interpret the resulting number, in any way. And to the question, what does the pillars have to do with it? I answer, it's not about the pillars, everything is much deeper. The influence is at the subatomic level, or to be more precise, at the energy level. And there will be people who will find this explanation convincing. And by the way, as we see later, if astrologers replace the planets with pillars, and generally come to the methodology described by me, then this will not affect the results of forecasts in any way. Absolutely. Other astrologers go even further and begin to talk about the vibrations of the planets, energy informational reality, and other things. That is, about things unknown to science. If astrologers know some new type of interaction, let them share it, receive a Nobel Prize, tell how they discovered it, with what devices they register and measure it, and also by what formulas they calculate its impact on humans and earthly events. And then astrology will return not only to universities, but even to kindergartens. But, as we understand, even here the matter does not go beyond scientific condemnations. It should be noted here that in general astrologers are very fond of shrouding their reasoning in pseudoscientific fog. Refer to scientific discoveries, count scientific terminology with pseudoscientific. That is, parasitize on the achievements of science. The properties of the psyche are such that when we see a person speaking confidently and literally pouring out terms, our trust in him increases. He seems to us to be a specialist who understands what he is talking about. And he didn't even think to figure it out. And he's not even responsible for his words, he just puts everything in one pile. For some people, such pseudoscientific vocabulary generally acts hypnotically. They seem to turn off any critical perception of the material. Some astrologers say that astrological knowledge was obtained by supernatural revelation. That is, someone was sleeping, meditating. But if we are talking about supernatural revelation, then the conversation about science immediately disappears. Besides, whose revelation is considered more correct? Indian, Chinese, Babylonian, or Mayan, as these astrologies often do not coincide. So, it is impossible to prove and justify the efficiency of astrology by the means available to modern science. Moreover, astrologers do not have access to these funds, they do not have a laboratory with expensive equipment. There are no multi-billion-dollar investments in research. There are no ways to calculate the influence of planets on human formation and earthly events, that is, there is nothing but just talk. Does this mean that astrology can't work? Not yet. This only means that astrology has no place among empirical sciences, that is, based on experience and experimental data, such as physics, and attempts to put it there are not entirely honest. But let's give astrology as a science another chance. Until now, we didn't know how gravity works, and perhaps even now we don't know everything. But this did not prevent 50 years ago from calculating the trajectories of satellites and sending them into space. Maybe there is something similar in astrology. In other words, it works, but as astrologers, in principle, it does not interest. And it works, according to them, from the fact that it is based on many thousands of years of observation experience, that is, it is statistically justified. Astrologers have been observing terrestrial events for thousands of years, correlating them with the position of the planets, and thus, something like a database has been formed, that is, astrological knowledge. But the thing is that today, there are no statistics confirming astrology. According to astrologers, this is due to the fact that it is very difficult to develop a statistical mechanism, due to the fact that a lot of factors need to be taken into account. But if today, with the availability of databases and computer technology, it is impossible to confirm astrological axioms, it's hard to imagine that ancient astrologers could have done this. But still, astrology seems to be an ancient knowledge in the eyes of many. Suddenly, this ancient knowledge has not developed for thousands of years, but has degraded. Each astrologer tried to improve it and added something of his own, and thus the ancient knowledge was blurred. This is generally such a common myth about the loss of some ancient knowledge, I would even say an archetype. Suddenly, the ancient astrologers possessed exactly the same knowledge that had not degraded. And what would you think? Do we have a chance to meet him? The fact is that during the excavations of the city of Nivea, namely the palace library of King Shurb, who did not live in the 7th century BC, clay cuneiform tablets of astrological content were found, about 7,000 records. This text is called Enuma Anulil. It was reprinted for almost 1,000 years, because due to the use of tablets, they fell into disrepair, and the texts had to be updated, as well as supplemented with new changes. So, let's get in touch with the unclouded ancient wisdom. Count a few lines from this text. If the moon becomes visible on the first day, the earth will be happy. If the day reaches its usual length, the kingdom of long days. If the moon wears a crown when it appears, the king will reach the highest rank. It is very interesting to know the opinion of modern astrologers about these texts. This is what is written about it in the Ontology of Esotericism. There is not a single reasonable word in this collection. If this astrological knowledge, recorded in the first millennium BC, was the total sum of the knowledge of all the peoples who were engaged in astrology at that time, then we can conclude from this that the astrological predictions made at that time were just a lottery. And also from there, the astrological art of interpretation cannot be imagined as a single sum of knowledge, which has been passed down from generation to generation from time immemorial in an unchanged form. On the contrary, from the point of view of today, this accumulated experience is very often meager and meaningless. The art of interpretation, transmitted in many works on astrology, broadcasts truths that are completely unsuitable for us, and which we can characterize as nonsense. Each of us who are engaged in astrology, if such a publication comes across, will be disappointed in it. Thus, he says that astrology is based on some ancient knowledge, and ancient experience is simply impossible, because this ancient experience represents the most primitive superstitions that do not work, even from the point of view of astrology. And now let's turn to the present. Attempts to statistically substantiate astrology were periodically made. Probably the most famous of them was undertaken by the French researcher Michel Gauquelin and his wife. Their research is still referred to by astrologers as confirming the workability of astrology. Here is what the New Astrological Encyclopedia writes about this. Together with his wife François Gauquelin, he conducted fundamental research that gave the most accurate and rigorous scientific confirmation of the working capacity of astrology, although in some points their conclusions differed from traditional astrology. So, let's note for ourselves the most accurate and rigorous scientific confirmation of the working capacity of astrology. Quite an ambitious statement. Let's check it out. Michel Gauquelin, according to the Archives Library, compiled a database of 27,000 dates of birth. These dates were sorted by profession: doctors, scientists, politicians, athletes, and so on. By compiling birth horoscopes for them, Gauquelin wanted to reveal the influence of the horoscope on the choice of profession. And here, as it seemed to him, he discovered a certain dependence, which later became known as the Mars effect. In the book, Doe of Cosmic Influences, he writes, in 2088 sports champions, Mars dominates alone, but with an amazing statistical frequency. It can be found ascending or culminating 452 times instead of 358. However, as Gauquelin himself noted, such unevenness was observed only in the so-called outstanding representatives of the profession selected by Gauquelin, and there were no deviations from the norm among ordinary representatives. How can this be explained? First of all, Gauquelin's research turned out to be incorrect from the point of view of mathematical analysis, since he incorrectly estimated the statistical error. The fact is that there may be so-called statistical bias or fluctuations in the source data. They decrease as the number of observations increases. So, the results of Gauquelin's research have never gone beyond the statistical error. In addition, guided by the purely principle of a person's celebrity, he could, albeit unconsciously, further increase this error, that is, introduce heterogeneous initial data, of which the consequences accused him. But the Book of Cosmic Influences contains not only a description of the so-called Mars effect, but also a study of Gauquelin on the performance of the entire horoscope, namely the zodiac, houses, and aspects. He also decided to check whether there is such a thing as astral heredity, about which astronomer Johannes Kepler wrote the following: "There is an argument in favor of the reliability of astrology, quite obvious and completely unconditional. This is a common horoscope of children and their parents." After conducting the necessary research, Gauquelin comes to the following conclusions: the existence of astral heredity, which Kepler, Schaunard and Kraft believed in, and which many astrologers still believe in, cannot be confirmed by facts in any way. Considering the facts as positive, the only thing that can finally be taken into account is what we wrote about in our article of 1962, which do not seem outdated today. Although positive results manifest themselves under some planetary conditions, here he is referring to the Mars effect. How to explain that nothing ever happens when studying the tradition of horoscopes in general? All this, in our opinion, finally excludes any possibility for the zodiac, aspects and houses to play any role in human life. Well, as we remember, according to astrologers, this is called the most accurate and rigorous scientific confirmation of the working capacity of astrology. Therefore, by the way, you should not try to learn astrology through articles or speeches of astrologers designed for the general public. Because what astrologers say in interviews for everyone and what they write in books for astrologers can sometimes be very different. And now let's look at some of the inconsistencies of astrology from the point of view of science. Science has a lot of claims and questions of astrology, although astrologers have learned to fend off some of these claims and explain them, at least for themselves. In general, looking ahead, it must be said that it is impossible to influence astrologers with any arguments from science. Rather, it is designed for people who are interested in, sympathize with astrology, but consider it a science. So, one of the claims to astrology is newspaper astrology, which divides the entire population of the Earth into 12 large groups with the same properties. But, as already mentioned, such astrology is nonsense from the point of view of science, common sense, and even astrology itself. Since astrologers also criticize this approach, saying that every person is unique. Therefore, this argument or this claim to astrology is, one might say, no longer relevant. But in spite of everything, newspaper astrology can be called the department of astrology, since it is engaged in its popularization and changing public consciousness. She instills the idea that astrology is almost an integral part of our life. Zodiac signs and astrological symbols surround us everywhere, and the most respected and authoritative people in our society, whose opinions are listened to, I'm talking about singers and artists, constantly discuss astrology and everything related to it on various TV shows. Therefore, no matter how many astrologers say that they are not related to newspaper astrology, they perfectly understand its significance and that it brings great benefits for them. The next scientific incongruity, which is often mentioned, is the geocentric system. Since astrologers still take into account when constructing a gyroscope that the Earth is in the center, and the Sun and planets revolve around it. But as the astrologers themselves say, we are quite satisfied with this. In other words, such a system is quite enough for our purposes. But still, it seems to me that astrology is not entirely sincere here because, as Dane Radyar writes, that when the heliocentric system was transferred, many of the traditional ideas, phrases and names of ancient geocentric astrology should have been rejected as devoid of logic. From the geocentric system follows the following, one might say, a funny feature of astrology, such as geographical limitation. As Michel Gauquelin wrote about this, astrology, having arisen in relatively low latitudes, did not suggest the possibility that none of the planets could be visible in high latitudes for several weeks in a row. In other words, there may be moments in the northern and southern latitudes when not a single planet is visible. And it follows from this that it is impossible for a person to build a horoscope. Also, since the Earth is in the center of the horoscope, it is impossible to make a horoscope for a person born outside the Earth. For example, on the Moon or on Mars. But astrologers answer that, yes, there is such a problem, but it just shows that the system is not fully developed yet. We need to work further. The next incongruity of astrology as a science is the problem of authority in astrology. There is no official textbook on astrology, just as there is no official astrology. There are more or less common directions that sometimes contradict each other. And this follows the following claim to astrology, such as the inconsistency of astrology systems. There are many astrological schools and methods that contradict each other. For example, a Chinese astrologer will interpret a horoscope differently than a European one. For example, in Chinese astrology, planets and wars are considered Venus, and in European Mars. Also, different schools of astrology may have different numbers of planets of zodiac signs. Another claim to astrology is the shift of constellations already mentioned. The fact is that European astrology did not take it into account, but Indian astrology did. Thus, in European and Indian astrology, a person will have a different zodiac sign. Which of the approaches is considered more correct? The next claim to astrology is the so-called Astro-Gemini, that is, people born at the same time in the same city. They should have the same horoscopes, the same research destinies, inclinations, abilities, and personality qualities. In 1958th year, an experiment was started in England, during which more than 2,000 astro-twins were observed. No similarity was found between them. Another incongruity of astrology as a science can be called the repeatability of the experiment. If, for example, there is a physical formula, then by supplying different values there, the physicist will get different results, which can then be repeated in practice. That is, I calculated and saw the same result practically. But in astrology, this principle does not work. As astrologer Margaret Height writes, astrology cannot always work in such a way as pure synchronicity. Because if astrology worked in such an objective way as a clock, it would be more appreciated in our culture, it would be more trusted. And we astrologers would be very rich people. But this is not the case. Everything is much more complicated. But in general, all claims to astrology from the side of science can be reduced to two main things. And this is not even the mechanism of its intended work. The first one: what makes you think that there is a connection between the position of the planets of the solar system and terrestrial events and human qualities? Prove this connection. So far, astrologers cannot provide any evidence of this connection. And here we must understand that we are not talking about tides or the fact that someone went out into the sun and tanned himself, but about the connection in the astrological sense. And the second claim is on the basis of what planets, zodiac, and everything else are attributed in astrology, those, and not other properties. How were they identified? Why exactly these properties and not others? Is it already if you close your eyes to the fact that these properties may be different in different schools of astrology? Usually the answer is that this is an ancient experience. But as we have seen, this ancient experience is simply a primitive superstition. Most likely, the explanation of astrological symbolism is found in the names of the planet, of the constellations themselves. For example, as for the planets, their properties were simply borrowed from the description of the deities of Greek mythology. Here it is necessary to understand that astrology generally deals with things that are not amenable to research. Astrologers believed that there was a connection between the positions of the planets and earthly events, but they could not substantiate, confirm, or clarify the nature of this connection in any way. How, for example, to justify the properties of Mars or to clarify them? Suddenly, astrologers described the properties of this planet not completely, or a little distorted. What should an astrologer measure, and most importantly, with what? To reveal the properties of Mars. These properties cannot be determined in any way, they can only be postulated, that is, simply accepted. While a physicist, for example, can correct a mistake if he made it, recalculate the results, measure the original data. Recheck. What will the astrologer measure and recheck if his forecast did not come true? Therefore, an astrologer cannot improve astrology. It cannot, in principle, be improved by the methods known to science. He can only explain his failures, interpret them. But in general, as has been said, most astrologers do not consider astrology a science in the exact sense of the word. Here, for example, is what Dane Radyar writes about astrology as a science. No matter what science has discovered in the field of cosmic radiation, we think that the philosophy of astrology will never be the same as the philosophy of any empirical science like physics, mechanics, or biology. He's also the same. The main purpose of astrology is to indicate opportunities for individual development. British astrologer Gregory Santa, in the book The Union of Heaven and Earth, the philosophy of astrology says the following: revealing to a person his individual myth, astrology gives him the meaning of life. From the above quotes, it becomes clear that scientific criticism, although it debunks the Philistine myth about astrology, still criticizes not exactly what astrology really is. And it is, as can be seen from these quotes, a kind of spiritual practice. There are many health checks of astrology. They are well described, and there is no point in dwelling on them in detail now. Let's mention just a few. It would seem that what is the most natural application of astrology? Predicting disasters, of course. And I must say that such an idea came not only to my head. They also thought about it in the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations at the beginning of the 2000th years. The fact is that at that time, a department was created in the Ministry of Emergency Situations, in which astrologers and psychics were involved in predicting various disasters. And a department was formed that tracked whose predictions came true, who didn't come true. And as the then head of the Ministry of Emergency Situations, Sergei Shoigu, said in an interview with Komsomolskaya Pravda, that even the champions of guessing come true no more than 4.5% of their prophecies. Another test of astrology, along with confirmation of its work, could be predictions for some public person who is always in sight. That is, astrologers, for example, predict a forecast for a year for some artist or politician, and then everyone looks. They are published in the newspaper, and then everyone looks at what has come true and what has not. If it came true, then everyone understands that yes, indeed, astrology works. And the fact is that such attempts are periodically made. For example, astrologers have long been haunted by Pope John Paul II. They were constantly predicting his death. For example, astrologers predicted the death of the Pope in 1992, but this did not happen. But astrologers did not calm down, and another one, for example, in order not to be mistaken, predicted a whole range from 2001 to 2004 years, that the Pope will die during this period. But the Pope died in the year 2005. And then there was information that someone from astrologers predicted it after all. But in fact, if you take an elderly person about 80 years old, and for 15 years predict to him every year that he will die, then someday, of course, your prediction will come true. One of the demonstration tests of astrology was made by Indian professor Jayant Narlikar. He selected the questionnaires of 200 children. 100 of them were gifted, and studied in schools for gifted children, and 100 were mentally retarded. Taking the necessary data to compile a horoscope, he suggested that astrologers make horoscopes and sort out some children from others. The astrologers who responded to his request showed a result close to simple guessing, that is, a random choice. Then he applied to the Institute of Astrology. Yes, there is such an institute in India. His employees, if you can call it that, demonstrated the same thing. Astrology, it's exactly about this, about abilities, talents, success, and so on. But, as we can see, astrologers could not separate talented children from the mentally retarded. Another characteristic test of astrology was made by Bernard Silverman. Everyone knows that astrology predicts the compatibility or incompatibility of spouses. This has already become a kind of dogma. Which zodiac signs are compatible, and so on. So he decided to check it out. He took the profiles of 3,000 happily married couples and 500 divorced couples. He suggested that astrologers make horoscopes for these couples and separate the happily married couples from the unhappy ones. And, as you already understand, the result was close to the usual guessing, that is, 0. In general, as already mentioned, there are many such astrology checks, and they are easy to find. And they all show the same result, from which we can conclude that astrology does not work. And if we criticized astrology only from the point of view of science, it would be possible to stop there. Because we have shown that astrology is not a science, that the properties of the planet of constellations are not based on anything. Their connection with earthly events cannot be confirmed, and the results of astrology checks show that it acts simply at random. But if that were the case, there would be no need to record this video, since there are enough similar videos already. The fact is that when you get acquainted with astrology, you encounter an interesting paradox. While the checks indicate that it is inoperable, the astrologers themselves state the opposite. And moreover, they do not just declare it, they see the efficiency of astrology on themselves, because they constantly make horoscopes for themselves. So, once mentioned by us, Dane Radyar made a horoscope for himself, and saw in it that he was in danger of a head injury. In order to avoid this injury, he did not go outside all day and stayed at home. And a picture fell off the wall and hit him on the head. How to explain it? To answer this question, let's find out what astrology really is and what its true mechanism is. In the previous section, we came to an interesting paradox. While all external checks show that astrology is inoperable, astrologers themselves declare that they see it working on themselves, since they make gyroscopes for themselves. Probably, a critic from science would call this deception or autosuggestion, and perhaps this is sometimes the case, but still does not explain the phenomenon in its entirety. How can this be explained? The answer is found in horary or clock astrology. The astrologer's question should be asked honestly. Derek Appleby writes, "When the question is asked honestly, the card meets some conditions that allow you to make a conclusion." Interesting, isn't it? One astrological website explains it this way. If a person really cares about the question asked, if there is a need to get an answer to it, the horoscope gives accurate and clear answers. If the question is asked rather out of idle curiosity, the horoscope often answers very vaguely. And going back to the scientific nature of astrology, you can imagine any known formula that gives an exact answer, the right answer. Only if we really need it, if our need for it is really real. But why should the question be asked honestly? Dan Radyar answers. The simple fact is that when a person's need is real, some force or intelligence, either in himself or related to him, turns out to be able to use the language of symbols to convey meaningful information and an indication to action. Belarusian astrologer Konstantin Fekenik writes the following. Astrology involves direct contacts of an individual with an invisible reality, that is, a living and intelligent, deeply organized world of subtle causes and primary influences. Astrology, according to Rader, is based on the so-called and intuitive comprehension, and intuition in this case should be understood as the ability of an astrologer to come into contact with the force mentioned by him, and the degree of ability to this contact is an indicator of the professionalism of the astrologer. Astrology relies on purposefully developed intuitive abilities, and in this sense, it is no more scientific than palmistry or fortune-telling on runes. Also the same author, it is necessary to strictly observe the ethics of relations with the egregor, because this is the most important condition for maintaining the purity of the channel into the information superindividual power system. The success of the astrologer's activity and the well-being of his client ultimately depends on the success of cooperation with the egregor. You see, not causality or synchronism, but a successful relationship with an egregor. The famous Russian astrologer Alexander Kamensky, who performed under the pseudonym of Asolom underwater, writes that spouses or astrological partners living according to the laws of cosmic ethics should feel the arrival of the egregor. Another quote from Gregor Reason's book, The Union of Heaven and Earth. In astrology, we are talking about individuals, not groups. The whole meaning and purpose of astrology is lost if attempts are made to predict the future of a person based on statistics. In other words, Michel Gauquelin, trying to find statistical confirmation of astrology, was just wasting time, because he was studying what astrology is not. A number of conclusions can be drawn from all that has been heard. The first one: it is impossible to make a self-fulfilling forecast to someone who has not asked for it. Why are all the checks not working? People who participated in astrology tests in absentia had no real need for an answer. So in their case, the predictions did not come true. And the radar had a real need and got pictures and on the head. If the question is asked to the astrologer dishonestly, that is, there is no real need for an answer, then the mentioned force simply will not come into contact with the astrologer. It also follows from this that it is impossible to come to an astrologer with a check or a draw. Second, now it is clear why astrologers are not convinced by all the results of astrology tests and in general all the arguments from science. They understand how it works, but they can't explain it to the outside world. It's just that if they explain it on TV, they will immediately turn from a mystical ancient science into a branch of terry occultism, the same as divination and everything else. And astrologers will lose most of their clients because there are enough occultists without astrologers, and not everyone is ready to turn to them. Third, now it is clear why astrologers are not confused by the numerous contradictions in astrology. Some astrologers have so many planets, others have so many. In one astrology, you may be one zodiac sign, and in another. But as astrologers say, if professionals work, the results will be the same. There are even cases of correct prediction based on someone else's mistakenly taken natal chart. Anyway, the result is not obtained from it. Here, for example, is what one St. Petersburg astrologer writes: in my experience, deep work with a client is a kind of weak trance, where the horoscope is not an end in itself, but helps to connect to a direct source of information. It so happens that sometimes I receive information about my client, which, on sound reflection, is quite difficult to explain through astrological symbolism. Then it turns out that the astrologer's deep immersion in the client's affairs can, in fact, abstract the astrologer from the horoscope and give him the correct information that contradicts the map and element of clairvoyance. So you understand what's going on. If an astrologer receives an answer that contradicts what is contained in the map, he will choose it because he considers it clairvoyance. For example, you came to an astrologer to find out compatibility with your future spouse. And although this does not mean anything, since astrology cannot predict compatibility, determine its incompatibility or incompatibility, an astrologer builds two horoscopes and supposedly reveals this compatibility. And let's say that from his check it follows that you are compatible, and he received the answer that no, you are incompatible. And he will name it to you, he will choose it. And hence the most curious question arises. And do astrologers need planets, zodiac signs, and everything else, all astrological symbolism and its interpretation? The construction of horoscopes, calculating the position of the planet, and everything else. That is, everything that astrology consists of. And it turns out that, in general, astrologers do not need it. Dane Ryer says the following about this: it should be added that the movement of the sun, the planet, the stars, is not the only material that can be used. Theoretically, everything will be based on symbolism. He writes, everything will serve as the basis of symbolism. Gregory Santa. In Mesopotamia, the study of animal behavior was practiced. The flight of birds was studied. If ants were fighting, it meant that the enemy was approaching. The question was asked to the sun god, then the lamb was stabbed, and all the internal organs were examined. So, it was important both the physical visibility of planets and other celestial phenomena, and the physical extraction and examination of the animal's liver. The ancients also observed comets and the changing color of the moon. And here is another very interesting quote. Dane Radyar quotes the occultist Israel Regardie. The sole purpose of the art of prediction is to develop the intuitive abilities of the student to such an extent that eventually, all technical methods of prediction can be discarded. When such a degree of development of abilities is achieved, a simple reflection on any problem automatically extracts the required information through an intuitive mechanism. In other words, the top of professionalism is to get in touch without the help of any techniques, without using any improvised means. Therefore, astrologers can generally use only one natal chart for all cases. For example, laminate it or draw it on the table. Or even change the image and take a crystal ball. Moreover, a professional astrologer who already makes contact when he wants can receive visitors in an empty room at all. But, as we understand, not everyone is ready for this, not everyone will understand it. Therefore, he continues to calculate the position of the planets, make gyroscopes, and pretend to interpret them. Also, many astrologers know such a thing as the inclusion effect. For example, a young man came to the astrologer who has been communicating with a girl for a long time, and they are doing well, and he came to find out their compatibility. The astrologer draws up two astrological charts and says that they are completely incompatible. And the next day there is a quarrel between them. This is called the inclusion effect, which consists in the fact that knowledge about the astrological map makes this map work harder. That is, the young man, until he knew that they were incompatible, did not experience any difficulties, and as soon as he found out, they immediately quarreled about her. And here another curious question arises. And these young people would have quarreled if one of them had not gone to an astrologer and found out about their complete incompatibility. And the picture would have fallen and hit Radyar on the head if he hadn't predicted it to himself. Thus, we can conclude that these were not forecasts, but programs. The power behind astrology not only gives the answer to the astrologer, but also executes it, literally invading human life. Having received the right to do so through a person's conscious appeal to the astrologer, which is why there is a real need for an answer. This force literally lives in astrology and is its mechanism, which, of course, is not subject to any scientific research. But it all works, if I may say so, only in the client-astrologer system, because outside of astrology, the force cannot interfere in the lives of people who have not addressed it. And as Konstantin Selikonnik wrote, found and studied with the help of astrology eventually self-actualizes. A correctly formulated project of psychological and moral development, as it were, crystallizes in the soul and actions of the seeker. That's exactly what we're talking about. Self-actualizing. From the example given about young people, we see that there is no better way to destroy a family or relationship than to turn to an astrologer. And this is not to mention synastic astrology, that is, the astrology of matrimony, in which there is a negative attitude to the blind study of generally accepted ideas and norms of being, to which astrologers include marital fidelity. Since we have touched on this topic, let's dwell on it a little. From the point of view of synastric astrology, partners should make a smooth transition from the earthly cosmic ethics of relationships. According to her solemn Podvodny, social and space ethics sometimes diverge quite a lot. I'm curious, but what is he talking about? Another author writes the following. In 1956 62nd years, Uranus in Leo, for the first time, tries to establish free love, a relationship of independence between partners. You will easily continue these characteristics. Still from the same place. With Uranus in the 12th house, the couple feels an urgent need to free themselves from the conventions and demands of society. Misunderstandings are often related to the fact that partners are sent to us for a short period of time, and with a rather limited program of interaction, so, in fact, the partner will not particularly connect me, unless I try to impose a network of lifelong connections on him. Or an astrologer can tell you that you don't need to get married or get married, because you played a karmic program with your partner before the wedding, and now you need to find another partner for further growth. And how such cosmic ethics ends, and to what logical end it comes, we will understand from an excerpt of articles by the Russian astrologer Albert Timoshev, a former student of Pavel Globa. I should make a reservation right away that the author of the article is responsible for the information given below, and I'm just quoting him, since this article is freely available. So he writes, Globa repeatedly arranged initiations, the opening of the third eye and the like, which were an ugly sexual orgy, at which many of his gullible students lost their virginity. Under the guise of the rites of the brightest and purest religion of goodness and light, the rituals of cleansing the city from filth. Vile satanic Sabbaths were held, from the description of which their eyewitnesses and participants make a normal person sick to the throat. And I must say that in a similar vein, Dane rather explains a fragment of the Gospel about the meeting of Jesus Christ with a Samaritan woman who had 5 husbands during her life and lived with a 6th. To the Samaritan woman, who, in her openness to the motives of love, had already rejected the narrow adherence to the old order, Jesus could reveal his mission. Here, in addition to cosmic ethics, we also see a completely distorted understanding of the Holy Scriptures, which, by the way, is characteristic of almost all astrologers and occultists. So, an astrologer is a person who comes into contact with some invisible force and tries to develop the ability to make easier contact with it. And now let's remember, how can such a person be called differently? That's right, a shaman. The shaman communicates with the spirits by entering into a trance. And the astrologer does the same thing, only instead of a tambourine, he uses a computer and a natal chart. Therefore, we must understand that a visit to an astrologer, it is no different from a visit to a shaman, except for the entourage. It should also be understood that not every resident of a megalopolis is ready to go to a shaman for a consultation and see how he will be. And when you go to an astrologer, you have a feeling that you are joining the ancient wisdom and science, and that the information is communicated to you. It is obtained as a result of objective scientific research. In other words, it's just a hoax. Thus, astrology is such a global scam, using what it has nothing to do with, that is, space and planets and stars. As Gregory Santa writes, the astrologer and the magician use the same symbols. And indeed, both approaches are part of the same system. In light of all that has been said, all the alleged scientific astrology simply evaporates, and what remains is what astrology really is, namely a cult practice. What happens? A person begins to practice astrology, thinking that this is an ancient science based on thousands of years of experience. But gradually delving into it, he actually becomes a shaman, communicating with certain forces that tell him the forecast. And then they themselves fulfill it. At the same time, all astrological knowledge and experience turn out to be overboard, simply unnecessary, which is understandable, since without astrological power, all this does not work by itself. Astrology exploits the sense of the incomprehensibility of the universe, the grandeur and beauty of the cosmos, appropriating to itself what it has nothing to do with. The construction of the interpretation of horoscopes in astrology is nothing more than a screen, a decoration, a prop, behind which communication with the other world is hidden. By and large, it doesn't even matter what to use as such props, planets, dice, or playing cards. If there were no astrological power, it would not be possible to make a real forecast. And we must understand that this power, it stands not only for astrology, but in general for all kinds of divination. As we remember, Gregory Santa wrote that in Mesopotamia they studied the list of animals, the flight of birds, and so on. In other words, all divination practices are signs or signs leading to the same thing, leading to this very force, to communication with it. What kind of power is this? With whom does the astrologer come into contact? The fact is that if I name it now, it may seem unconvincing to someone, and astrologers will have an attack of sarcasm. So let's let them speak for themselves. Let them tell us about it in as much detail as possible. About the Nidesheim flu. Before summoning any evil spirit into the circle, we need to know its nature, which planet it belongs to, and what powers of this planet it possesses. Gregory Santa, the demon remains demonic if it is separated from the divine from which it originates. And he's the same. In order to be free, they, Adam and Eve, had to break out of the womb. Interestingly, the figure of Saturn represents the authority from which they had to separate, as well as Satan, the tempter, who gave them knowledge that allowed them to become free. Russian astrologer Albert Timoshev, fear in principle arose when people rejected the night deities. The roots of cruelty do not come from the dark side of the universe, from ourselves, who deny and do not want to accept it. Jung. Yes, he is not an astrologer, but he was engaged in astrology. He may well be called an ideologist astrology. So he writes, the devil, like the Gnostic archons, dwells in the firmament. And presumably he and his angels correspond to astrological gods and influences. Let's talk a little bit about Jung. The fact is that he was not only a psychologist, but also an occultist, and he became an occultist much earlier, having organized a spiritualist circle in his youth. He also studied astrology and alchemy. He heard voices inside himself and talked to them. For example, a certain woman lived in it, who, according to him, intruded into his thoughts. This led to the appearance of the archetype of the anima, that is, the feminine principle in the male psyche, which he attributed, extended to all men. Jung also saw a vision, fell into the underworld, as he called it, in which something similar to magical initiations happened to him. He communicated with characters that no one else had seen. For example, one of Jung's mentors was a certain Philemon, a creature in the form of an old man with horns and wings. At times, Jung wrote, he was completely real. I was walking with him in the garden, and he was something like what they call a guru in India. Philemon communicated with Jung on psychological topics, and Jung, based on the information received from him, voiced it in the form of innovative approaches to psychology. Therefore, by the way, when psychologists voice Jung's ideas and use his terminology, they partly voice what Philemon told him. Another mentor of Jung was a certain K. He appeared to him for the first time, climbing out of the earth's crevice. And in his face, according to Jung, there was something demonic or Mephistophelic, introducing the concept of synchronicity. Jung wanted to substantiate the existence of paranormal phenomena that surrounded his family. They had a poltergeist at home, and, according to Jung's recollections, his daughter's blanket disappeared twice during the night, and the house was filled with ghosts. Also, his daughter and mother were contacts with spirits, as, indeed, Jung himself. In general, it should be noted that a number of Jung's ideas, such as collective unconscious, archetypes, synchronicity, do not have a scientific character. Professor Richard Newell, author of the book The Secret Life of Carl Jung, believes that the psychological mask was created by Jung deliberately and partly falsely, in order to make his own magical polytheistic and pagan worldview more attractive to the secularized world, which tends to recognize only those ideas that seem to have a scientific tinge. In other words, Jung is not a psychologist who sometimes dabbled in the occult, but an occultist, a pagan, and a preacher of polygamy. who wrapped these ideas in a psychological wrapper to give them greater credibility. And he directly prescribed as a medical remedy for married men who were his patients to have mistresses in order, as Jung believed, to release instinctive creative energy. And he certainly did not deny himself the release of this energy by having affairs with patients. And when his wife gave birth to 5 children, he informed her, that is, he simply confronted her with the fact that they were starting a free relationship with you. And he had a schedule when and with whom he communicates, and on weekends, for example, one of his mistresses could come and spend time with him and his family. Perhaps someone will say that this is a high relationship, but as for me, it's just an abomination. And Jung behaved towards his wife just like a pig. And not just like a pig, he brought a supposedly scientific basis for this. You can imagine how he explained to her about the collective unconscious and archetypes. And not only that, he launched this teaching to the masses. The next one we can still meet in modern medicine. Echoes, so to speak. The fact is that Jung believed that in order to achieve physical and mental health, as well as for people to reach a new level of being, it is necessary to get rid of socio-ethical norms, as well as to break family, social, and religious shackles. We have already met a similar approach, as you remember, in synastic astrology, with its so-called cosmic ethics. And, by the way, in exactly the same way, that is, summing up the scientific base, Jung justified Nazism. For example, he wrote that the Aryan unconscious has a higher potential compared to the Jewish one. And he called Hitler a visionary, a spiritual vessel, the first person to explain to every German what he thinks and what he feels in his unconscious mind about the fate of Germany. He also believed that Hitler drew his extraordinary energy from the Teutonic unconscious. As they say, you can't dig in, everything is strictly scientific. Of course, then Jung justified himself, blaming it on the demands of the time. Now Jung has many admirers who call him a genius, but this situation reminds me of Malevich's Black Square, when everyone praises. And those who express doubts immediately sign up as Lopotnik men who do not understand anything about art. Of course, I will say right away that I am not a specialist, and therefore, I do not undertake to make judgments about the influence of Jung's work on modern science, but nevertheless, it seems to me that his personality and ideas are greatly overestimated and somewhat discredit psychology as a science. And, by the way, do you know the name of the foundation that publishes unpublished works by Jung, the Philemon Foundation? The fact is that Jung has many unpublished works. This foundation plans to publish up to 30 volumes, since relatives who keep his essay and correspondence are in no hurry to share it with the public, referring to the fact that these writings will allegedly be misunderstood. But in fact, it seems to me, because after their publication, Jung will appear in a completely different light. Many famous astrologers subsequently relied on Jung's idea. He also believed that he was initiated into a mystical brotherhood with Julian the Apostate, and considered Christianity his personal enemy. Just as eyewitnesses recall, he could not pronounce the word church without swearing. One of Jung's followers recalled that when she wanted to convert to Catholicism, he wrote to her the following: "There is no place next to me for those who are in the bosom of the church. Your confessor is here, not there, that is, he is talking about himself. I serve for those people who are outside the church." And when Neela Jaffe wrote a biography of Jung, she refused to include this letter there. Curious, isn't it? In other words, Jung's biography is quite heavily combed. According to the memoirs of those who knew him for many years, Jung himself behaved as if his psychology was another religion. He believed that good and evil are just concepts, and that a person can afford not to do good, but to do evil, if this is his ethical choice. He also believed that it was necessary to revise the dogma of the Holy Trinity, and include Satan there. In general, this topic is quite interesting, and requires more detailed research. But now let's go back to astrology again. As we remember, A horoscope can endow a person with the most negative moral qualities. What do some astrologers suggest a person to do with this? Gregory Santa writes, "The task first of all is to reveal our true pattern, which is symbolized by the horoscope, and, secondly, to coordinate ourselves with this pattern." Still from the same place. And having a birth card and being that card are completely different things. The latter implies a conscious acceptance of who we are. That is, according to Gregory Santa, the horoscope, whatever qualities it contains, is what a person should become. The program of his development, given to him, so to speak, during his earthly life. Radiner writes about this as follows. No part, nothing in the map should be considered as bad or harmful. Here it is necessary to touch upon the question of what is good and evil from the point of view of Christianity and astrology. At the beginning, let's look at the Christian view and count a few quotes from the Philokalia. Everything that happens in the world is threefold, namely, good, evil, and average. In human affairs, nothing should be considered an essential good, except for one spiritual virtue, which, leading us to God, compels sincere faith to constantly cling to this unchangeable good. And, on the contrary, nothing should be considered evil, except for one sin, which, separating us from the good God, connects with the evil devil. The mean is that which can be related to one or the other side, judging by the quality or location of the user, such as wealth, power, honor, bodily strength, health, beauty, life or death itself, poverty, weakness of the flesh, sexual, and so on. And everything like that, according to the quality and location of the user, it can serve either for good or for a goat. And one more quote from Saint Anthony the Great. God, having created man autocratic, as all generous and good things are not envious, has given him the opportunity, if he wants, to please God. It pleases God that there is no evil in man. For if people praise the good deeds and virtues of a holy and God-loving soul, but condemn the righteous and evil deeds, it is not from the earth that the side that wants salvation for man is not from the earth. So, let's remember, it pleases God that there is no evil in man. And how does astrology look at this question? This is Gregory Santa. The shadowy, undeveloped, inferior, dark, evil side must be recognized and accepted. These archetypes meet within us as a shadow or a demon. That is why astrology, combined with psychotherapy, by recognizing the nature of these archetypal forces, can point to the ideal way of treatment. If we can convince ourselves to kiss a frog, then we will transform it from growth into beauty, and it will stop bothering us. According to Gregory Santa, astrological psychotherapy is for a person to accept what can be called the dark side, or a demon. And now let's compare this with a quote from the founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey. Satan is a manifestation of the dark sides of human nature. It must be cultivated, which we do in our temple with the help of various magic spells. Do you see the difference of views on this issue between astrologers and Satanists? Personally, I don't. But if Satanism has a dark and repulsive image, then astrology in the eyes of many seems to be either science, psychology, or ancient mystical wisdom. As we can see, the power behind astrology manifests itself not only in forecasts and their execution, but also in the worldview, telling astrologers, and through them, and everyone else, what is good and what is bad, that is, what a person should be. Here it is appropriate to touch upon what conscience is. Reverend Ava Dorotheus calls conscience a natural law in man, showing him what is good and what is evil. Conscience, according to him, is like a well that we fall asleep when committing a sin, so we need to strictly monitor our conscience, so that it does not convict us of anything, even of the slightest offenses, because by trampling on conscience in small things, a person acquires a bad skill and gradually becomes established in evil because, as he writes Ava Dorotheus, virtues and sins begin from small and come to great good or evil, and the guilt generated by conscience encourages us to correct ourselves. For example, when we have offended a person and our conscience reproaches us, we go to him and ask for forgiveness. And what do astrologers say about this? Dane Radiar writes, "The feeling of guilt interferes with the attempts of self-transformation of a person. What people call the voice of conscience is a manifestation of the self-transformation function that has encountered some obstacles. Each person should be ready for the next evolutionary step in his personal or group life, but often he is thrown back by the inertia of previous experience. I'm curious, but what kind of evolutionary steps are these that conscience prevents? Conscience and guilt, if it can be called inhibiting self-transformation, then only if it is understood not as development, but as degradation. If people had no conscience, the world would have ceased to exist long ago. And this is what astrology leads to in the limit. It also resembles the practice of occult initiations, when in order to achieve, for initiation into the next level, a person needs to commit some immoral act. Astrological teaching, apparently equally related to good and evil, in fact legalizes evil, removing a person's sense of guilt for bad deeds and opening the way to so-called freedom. One of the astrologers will object, saying that he does not think so and generally tries to fight negative qualities in the soul. Maybe. But how is it impossible not to get dirty for a person who goes down the sewer every day? It's the same here. And in general, any negative changes in the soul do not occur immediately, but gradually, first causing rejection, then indifference, and finally becoming the norm, gradually capturing healthy areas of the heart and way of thinking. Studying astrology, delving into it, a person gradually becomes damaged and, perhaps, starting as an astrologer, thinking that astrology is a science, he gets acquainted with the books of occultist astrologers and gradually adopts their teachings. And even if he studies astrology only according to Ptolemy, he will come to a situation that his predictions do not come true. Because all this does not work by itself, and something else is needed, intuitive contact is needed. From the point of view of the gospel, the path of a person's spiritual development consists in cleansing the heart of passions, through the fulfillment of New Testament or Gospel commandments, which are not just abstract moral teachings given for an incomprehensible purpose, but reflect the properties of God Himself. Be merciful, just as your heavenly Father is merciful. Or another commandment, learn from me. I am like a mouth and humble in heart. In other words, God has said of Himself that He is merciful, meek, and humble. A person who fulfills the gospel commandments, who is guided in life by the gospel, morally becomes like God and becomes akin to Him, and during his life acquires the quality necessary for the inheritance of eternal life. Actually, this is why earthly life is given to a person, so that he has time to acquire and restore the likeness of God. The opposite is also true. The one who violates the commandments moves away from the properties of God and acquires the opposite properties, that is, the properties of fallen spirits. He becomes similar in spiritual qualities to them, although outwardly he may seem quite a decent person, who does not have any gross vices outwardly. Therefore, it is not difficult to understand from what source the ideology of the relativity of good and evil flows, and to what fruits it leads. God communicates His grace and power to people who force themselves to fulfill the commandments, and struggle with the negative movements that arise inside. So does the fallen spirit. He communicates his power in exchange for sin, for breaking the commandments. This is how he fights with God, to whom he can do nothing but force his creation, man, to serve himself, to fulfill his fallen will. And here it must be said that any contact with astrologers is a serious danger for a person. Even if the client is not ready for this moment in time, nevertheless, the truth will be introduced into his subconscious by drawing symbols. Then, when it becomes ready, perhaps many years later, this seed will germinate and enter consciousness. And Grego Risanta. The purpose of using a system like tarot or astrology is not to reveal what will happen, but to come into contact with the subconscious of another person with the help of symbols, and thus, establishing a person's contact with his unconscious needs helps him to comprehend what he really wants. Astrologer Stefan Roy writes, "It is magic that has a therapeutic effect on people through the study of astrology or individual consultation." Radyar. The type of help may be very different from what the client expected before meeting you. Here, the word help should be understood in the light of all of the above. For example, by going to an astrologer for some minor question, for example, to find out when I go on vacation. A person is subjected, so to speak, to a full package of astrological services for the introduction of an astrological way of thinking into the subconscious, which will explain to him what he really wants. And besides, by coming to an astrologer, a person gives the right to the forces behind astrology to interfere in his life. Sometimes the following can happen. The client will clap his eyes and say, "And I don't understand what's wrong with me, I'm going crazy. You've worked with me, and I'm going to hang myself tomorrow. Are you sure I won't hang myself?" You have to be ready for this text and have some kind of answer to it. It was a fragment from lectures by the astrologer on psychology, A.V. Salomu Underwater. So, what kind of power is this? Holy Scripture and the Holy Fathers have been warning for several millennia that a fallen spirit acts in astrology and other occult practices. However, as one could see, it is easy to come to this conclusion simply by studying the books of the astrologers themselves and their statements. When astrologers hear this, they usually have an attack of sarcasm, and they begin to accuse the Orthodox of being blinded by obscurantism. In general, it is curious that occultists, that is, people who come into contact with fallen spirits, are so ironic about the words demons, devil, and so on. Apparently, they think that the Orthodox mean a man in a padded jacket with horns and kirzacha. But the fact is that fallen spirits, in order to seduce a person, appear for the most part to people, not in their terrible appearance, but in the form of light, luminous figures, in the form of voices, beautiful music, fragrance, thoughts that seem sublime, and feelings that seem new and unusual. And after all this, a person has no immunity. When faced with this, a person usually accepts it and then begins to consider himself special, that is, to be proud of it. Fallen angels appear in their true form to those who have already understood who they are dealing with, or by special permission of God. Someone will object, "And if I don't go to astrologers, but just read horoscopes in newspapers, am I putting my life in danger?" The fact is that even if there were no fallen spirits listening to the advice of astrologers, a person incredibly complicates his life, filling it with a set of meaningless non-working recommendations: do this, and do not do this. If a person believes that the planets affect him in an astrological sense, then this is called superstition. But superstition is not a safe thing. Everything that happens to a person happens by the will or by the permission of God. And superstition, if I may say so, takes away part of God's powers, takes them for itself, and transfers them to black cats, spilled salt, empty buckets, and everything else, thus making these objects paramount in a person's life, and makes God secondary for a person. In addition, the stronger the belief in superstition, the more power the fallen spirits gain over a person's life. He gave it to them himself, ceasing to trust God, leaving to trust the stupidest things, or thinking that by spitting and knocking 3 times on wood, he would somehow protect himself with this. That it was not God who was protecting him, but this very action, which was an insult to God. Therefore, for example, to the question, why do signs come true? The monk Seraphim of Sarov answered, "Do not believe, and they will not come true." Faith is, by the way, a very important thing. It shows who we trust: God, or, for example, a piece of wood on which we knock, and think that this will protect us from some misfortunes. Therefore, by the way, anyone who believed in omens, or who believed in zodiac signs and simpler, should stop paying attention to it. And everything said will cease to affect his life, and have any meaning for him. it will become much easier for him to live? Sometimes you can hear the following: well, astrology doesn't work, but astropsychology is kind of like psychology. So an astrologer can in some situations help a person in a difficult situation, calm him down, and so on. The fact is that astropsychology is a pseudoscience, and psychology is not a game of a psychologist when a person listens to you nodding and gives some advice. The vast majority of astrologers have no psychological education, and it is not only unsafe to conduct psychological practice in their case, but also illegal. In addition, trying to identify and treat mental disorders with the help of a natal chart is simply dangerous for health. But since we have touched on health, there is such a subspecies of astrology as medical astrology. He is engaged, no matter how terrible it may sound, in health and disease prevention based on the fact that certain organs in a person and parts of a person correspond to certain signs of the zodiac. And since this in itself does not work, then turning to medical astrology is simply putting your health and life at risk. Well, and if not by itself, can fallen spirits help a person, for example, with health? Here, for example, is a famous astrologer and an underwater salon. He wrote books on astrology, and in general, as I have already said, is known to almost all Russian astrologers. But in the 14th year, he was diagnosed with cancer. He was treated for several years, and, in my opinion, he died in the 18th year. He probably made up his horoscopes. And for sure, as follows from his books, he communicated with the astrological force, as we now understand, with fallen spirits. But they did not consider it necessary to inform him about his illness. They have no purpose to benefit a person. But why does astrologers come into contact with fallen spirits and not with bright angels? Because humanity on earth itself is in a fall, and by its own efforts can achieve communication only with them. The soul that is defiled, said the monk Isaac the Siren, does not enter into the pure kingdom, and does not combine with the spirits of the saints. Man on earth is himself a fallen spirit. Only his fall is not final. He can still repent and correct himself and turn to God, unlike them. Those who wish to familiarize themselves with this issue in more detail can be recommended in the essay of Ignatius Brenchaninov's Witnesses, a word about the sensual and spiritual appearance of non-spirits. Let's count a few words from it. Holy angels appear only to holy people who have restored communion with God and with them with a holy life. Although demons, appearing to people, most take the form of light angels for the most convenient deception. Although they sometimes predict the future, although they reveal secrets, but they should not be trusted in any way. They have the truth mixed with lies. The truth is used at times only for the most convenient seduction. The idea that there is anything particularly important in sensory communication with spirits is erroneous. The sensuous vision of the spiritless does not provide a proper concept of spirits, it only provides a superficial concept of them. It is very convenient to deliver the most erroneous concepts. It is they who are most pleased with the inexperienced and infected with vanity and self-conceit. The spiritual vision of spirits is achieved only by true Christians, but people of the most depraved life are most capable of sensual vision, who see spirits and are in sensual communion with them. The Magi who renounced God and recognized Satan as God. People who have given themselves up to passions and have resorted to the Magi to satisfy them. Who have entered into explicit communication with fallen spirits through them, which is done under the indispensable condition of renunciation of Christ. A man exhausted by drunkenness and a depraved life, ascetics who have fallen into self-conceit and pride. This is the Orthodox Church's understanding of the issue under consideration and its view of practices that lead to the so-called rejection of feelings or to communication with the other world. And now back to the beginning of our conversation. Why should the astrologer be asked honestly, and why astrological forecasts, and in fact programs, do not work in the lives of those people who do not turn to astrology? Saint Cyril of Jerusalem answers, run away from any diabolical action, and do not obey the whole dragon, an apostate who spontaneously changed his good being. He can conquer anyone who wants to, but he can't force anyone to do it. Without listening to the teachings of astrologers, or the bird divination, or the phenomenon, or the fabulous Hellenic divination. Do you see what Saint Cyril writes? He can conquer anyone who wants to, but he can't force anyone to do it. Why is the honesty of the question a criterion? It shows that a person came voluntarily and feels a real need for an answer. Reverend Maxim the Greek, hear the God of the inspired Father Basil the Great, who says, "Do you see what evil it is for you to do magic? The subsequent deceptions of magic are left out of God's providence." Blessed Augustine, it must be confessed that sometimes they say something true, but they speak according to some innermost suggestion that the ignorant human mind experiences. Since this serves to catch people, it happens to be the action of corrupted spirits who are allowed to know something true, from the realm of temporary objects. The Orthodox Church has always treated astrology as a kind of witchcraft, or what is also, as a practice that leads to communication with fallen spirits, and therefore forbade its children to engage in both witchcraft and astrology. Sometimes you can hear indignation against the Orthodox Church. How can it forbid something? The fact is that all the decrees of the Holy Fathers and Councils apply only to Orthodox Christians. If we open the apostolic epistles, we will not find there a single instruction or appeal to the Gentiles who have not yet believed, only to those who have applied. The moral dogmatic decrees of the Church are needed in order to show Orthodox Christians that by violating them, they harm their salvation, their soul, and they expel themselves from the confines of the Church. In other words, they cease to be Orthodox Christians, although, of course, they can consider themselves as such and even declare it. The Church is often likened to a ship, and its eve in this case can be likened to a fence on the deck of this ship. By designating practices that lead to apostasy from God, the Church shows that by engaging in them, a person leaves the Church himself. Therefore, those who have read horoscopes should stop doing this and stop correlating their actions with the recommendations of astrologers. And even more so, they should stop justifying their shortcomings and vices, referring to the horoscope. Allegedly, the planets and stars were made like this. Through this, he also indirectly blasphemes God, allegedly through the planets and stars who put vicious inclinations into his soul. But that's not true. God has not made man bad either by himself or through the planets. He gave him the freedom to choose between good and evil. Yes, by committing evil, a person gradually becomes dependent on him and can no longer get rid of him himself. And he gets rid of it through sincere repentance and confession, which will be confirmed by anyone who came to orthodoxy at a conscious age. And as for astrology, a person will receive incomparably greater benefits if, instead of consulting a horoscope before any business, he briefly prays to God for help and admonition. If this business is, of course, good, and he should not have evil deeds. Sometimes astrologers say that astrology supposedly helps to know the will of God, but this is not true, because to know the will of God, you do not need to go so far. It is God's will that a person should correctly believe in God, as God has revealed about himself, and live according to the commandments of the gospel, that is, fulfill them by deed, word, and thought. The gospel commandments listed in the Gospel of Matthew from the 5th to the 7th chapter. By fulfilling the commandments and learning from them, a person will regain the lost God-likeness. And turning to astrologers, a person does just the opposite. He turns to fallen spirits, and through this, as it were, morally becomes related to them, borrows their properties, and thereby alienates himself even further from God. The prohibition to turn to astrologers and sorcerers, or in modern terms to psychics, is still in the Old Testament. You should not have a soothsayer, a fortune teller, a sorcerer, a charmer, a summoner of spirits, a magician, and a questioner of the dead. For everyone who does this is abominable before the Lord. Because of this abomination, the Lord your God cast them out from before you. Be blameless before the Lord your God. For the nations from which you drive out listen to fortune tellers and soothsayers. But the Lord your God has not given you that. Stay then with your magics and with your many sorceries, which you have been engaged in from your youth. Maybe you will help yourself, maybe you will resist. You are weary of your many counsels. Let the observers of the heavens, and the stargazers, and the forerunner of the new moons come out, and save you from what is about to happen to you. Here they are like straw, the fire has burned them, they have not delivered their souls from the flame. And you do not listen to your prophets and your fortune tellers, and your dreamers, and your magicians, from your astrologers, who say to you, it will not serve the king of Babylon, for they prophesy lies to you to remove you from your land, and that I will expel you, and you will perish. One of the most frequent arguments in defense of astrology is the mention of the gospel narrative, about the adoration of the Magi to the infant Christ, about whose nativity they learned through a star. But the fact is that it was not a star in the usual sense of the word, but a special sign of God, since it behaved contrary to the laws of physics. She did not move like all the other stars, appeared and disappeared, walked in front of the Magi, and finally sank over the place where the Christ child was. Stars don't behave like that. Babylonian astrologers knew about the prophecy that the Jews should have a Messiah. And when they saw a new star moving across the sky in a completely different way from all the other stars, they realized that the prophecy had been fulfilled, and went to personally verify this and worship Christ. In other words, God led them through what they were doing, through an unusual star, just as the Lord led the Apostle Peter to faith, through what he was doing, namely through an unusually large catch of fish. A new star and a big catch of fish for us, most likely, would not be arguments, since we do not understand anything about it. The Apostle Peter was a fisherman for many years, and he was able to understand that this is a supernatural catch that can only be explained by a miracle. Also, Babylonian astrologers, they realized that the new star was a miracle because they had never seen anything like it before. This was also attributed to the conversion of pagans to Christianity. According to legend, these magi became Christians and were martyred. Do the fallen spirits know the future? Why are even experienced astrologers wrong? The witness Ignatius Princhananov answers. Demons do not know the future, known to the one God, and those intelligent creatures of his, to whom God is pleased to reveal the future. But just as intelligent and experienced people from the events that have taken place or are taking place, foresee or anticipate events that have to take place, so cunning, highly experienced evil spirits can sometimes assume with certainty and predict the future. They often make mistakes, very often lie, and lead to confusion and doubts with unclear proofs. Sometimes they can foretell an event that is already intended in the spirit world, but has not yet been carried out between people. Thus, before the temptations befell the righteous Job, the omission of these temptations had already been decided in the counsel of God, and was known to the fallen spirit. So the destruction of the king of Israel, Ohab, was decided at the judgment of God, known to the holy heavenly powers and the rejected angels, faithfully to the fulfillment of the evil spirit, before the king set out on a campaign. This is how the devil predicted the temptation to Saint John, Archbishop of Novgorod, which he later brought upon him. The one who turns to the astrologer turns to the fallen spirit. It can be considered that this is the same thing, and thus endangers his life and the lives of his loved ones. Because, through the fact of this conversion, a person shows that he trusts them more than God. Moreover, from communication with fallen spirits, a person morally becomes related to them, becomes infected with their properties. First of all, hatred of God, as a result of which such people will find themselves after death, not with God, but with fallen spirits, and will share their fate. Thus, astrology is one of the tools of the fallen spirits to enslave humanity itself. Therefore, let's not take our salvation lightly and explore each spiritual practice on our own experience. It is possible not to be damaged aimlessly. Our way of thinking and spiritual vision will be distorted, and we simply will not be able to see the truth and return to it. As one of the astrologers said, occult knowledge changes a person completely and completely. And here we can agree with him. Having joined the occult knowledge, a person is severely damaged. First of all, this can be seen in famous astrologers and other occultists in their attitude to the gospel. They see the gospel events as if through some very dirty and distorted glass. Yes, sometimes astrologers call themselves Christians and believers, but this is self-deception. If they believe in God, they should stop doing astrology, because the Lord forbids them to do it. They must repent to God that they were engaged in astrology, and through this their life will be freed from the power of fallen spirits over it. This is the end of the conversation about astrology, but as an afterword, I would like to offer you a fragment from a documentary film in which a former astrologer speaks.
It's just that life somehow turned out that I found myself in this universal flow. There was a time when everyone was interested in some kind of such things. They called it business. Now, as if looking into the past, I understand that there really was some kind of crazy flow. But apparently, there was no main thing, and even then, while doing this so-called business, I was always drawn somewhere to the side. I took an astrology course. I started going to classes, studied for a long time, for 2 years, and there have already been some such occult questions. Well, how so? Here people somehow remember comma. They see something like that there. I can't see anything. And suddenly one day, one of my employees calls me, "Do you want to light up the office?" I say, "But let's get an apartment." She asked the priest, said, "Please, can you light up the apartment?" I say, "Hello, Father. Here I have to tell you something before you go with me, because maybe you don't want to go with me after what I tell you." I say I'm doing astrology. We drove for 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, there was a turning point in me, and now I feel that something is happening. Something is happening. It's like, the clock turned on. I didn't understand yet that it was orthodoxy there, what and how. I understood that this person had brought me something that it was impossible to live without. But here is some component part, a very important component part of my life. Literally there, a few days after this meeting, I had to go to another lecture on astrology. I came to these courses, the Museum of the Peoples of the East. The teacher is also astrology beauty Elena. She would sit down in a chair and begin to tell. And here I am sitting and remembering my father, just this meeting, and suddenly a young man bends down from behind and says, "Here I see some streams there. What interesting work is going on. There are some birds there." I suddenly think, what do I see? I look at the stage with horror, and I see this beautiful Elena sitting in a chair, and next to her right, there is a shaggy demon with hooves. His paw is on her shoulder. It's just awful. And at this point the lecture ends. I grab my briefcase and run from there. I came home, picked up all these books, called all my friends, and told them that I was leaving. Astrology is, as it were, over and done with once and for all. And the group fell apart astrologically. I immediately called my father in the desert and rushed here.
Nie